baring its teeth. The Americans are giving the Japanese Air Force all it can handle. This group of volunteers is led by a flamboyant colonel named Claire Chennault. In the years between the wars, when most of the officers in the Army Air Corps were unabashed proponents of the heavy bomber, claiming it was an invincible weapon, Chennault remained a vocal advocate of the fighter plane. He argued that the pursuit plane's ineffectiveness was not due to design limitations of the plane, rather it was due to the tactics devised in World War I. To Chennault, the idea of dueling the enemy in one-on-one dogfights was romantic nonsense. Infantrymen do not win battles alone. Only by working together as a team, combining their firepower, can they achieve victory. The same, Chennault argued, is true of fighter planes. In 1937, Chiang Kai-shek, after hearing of Chennault's expertise in pursuit planes, asked him to be an advisor to the Chinese Air Force. On his arrival, Chennault found the situation worse than he could have imagined. Chinese pilots who were supposedly combat ready routinely crashed, simply taking off and landing. Chennault immediately began to revamp the Air Force. He established new training procedures, devised new tactics, and established a vast radio network to warn of the approach of Japanese bombers. Although they were improving, the Chinese pilots were in desperate need of help. By 1941, 100 Japanese planes a day were bombing Chongqing, and the Chinese were having little luck in stemming the tide. Under pressure from Chiang Kai-shek, President Roosevelt reluctantly agreed to let Chennault hire American pilots to fly for the Chinese. Chennault also managed to buy 100 P-40s, which the British had rejected as obsolete. By late summer of 1941, Chennault had recruited 112 pilots and was pushing them through an intensive training program. Flying their first mission on 20 December, the Tigers stun the Japanese. A flight of 20 bombers headed for Kunming is jumped by the fearsome-looking P-40s and is nearly annihilated, with only one bomber returning home. Day after day, the Tigers engage the Japanese with tremendous success. Working in pairs, the Americans make diving passes at the Japanese planes, sending them hurtling toward the ground in flames. Although they are getting the better of the Japanese, the daily combat and the lack of replacement planes and spare parts is beginning to take its toll. Leaking gas tanks are plugged with chewing gum. Bullet-riddled fuselages are repaired with adhesive tape. It takes all the American ingenuity the air crews can muster simply to keep the planes in the air. The Flying Tigers continue to cause the Japanese a considerable amount of frustration. Although their Zeros are faster and more maneuverable than the outdated P-40s, the Americans continue to rack up victories. Although it is certain that this small group of American pilots cannot turn the tide of the war alone, their mere existence and continuing success are enough to worry the Japanese and to spark a flame of hope in the hearts of the American people.
When the history of this war is written, it will be without doubt a history not only of heroism and strategy, but also of technological innovation. Case in point, what to do about pilots down behind enemy lines. The problem has frustrated all efforts since the beginning of aviation. One solution is offered by visionary engineers, a quick pick-me-up courtesy of the Army Air Force. A dead weight, similar to that of the average man, is attached to a raised rigging. When all is ready, a rescue plane flies in low and... Engineers pronounce the initial test a success and, defying all practical logic, move on to the next experiment. A sheep, chosen because its delicate internal anatomy is similar to that of humans, is strapped into the harness. Once lifted into the air, it takes 2 minutes and 45 seconds to hoist the sheep up into the aircraft. Returned to Earth, the sheep appears shaky, but little worse for the wear. Since snatching farm animals from behind enemy lines has little military value, the next test subject is an enlisted man. A volunteer, or so we're told, is strapped into a parachute-like harness to assure once up, he won't come down. Then, he awaits his fate. With the aircraft traveling at an indicated airspeed of 130 miles an hour, the subject is pulled first up and then along behind the plane. An electric winch pulls him slowly on board. The engineers again pronounce the test a success and claim snatch pickup will save many lives. Whether it does it by rescuing stranded personnel or discouraging pilots from getting lost in the first place remains to be seen.
9 February 1942, Singapore. Japanese troops, who for more than 2 months have been fighting to occupy the city, take their first strategic objective, Denga Airfield. Charged by their superiors in Tokyo with conquering the island in 100 days, they are now well ahead of schedule. The airfield, while badly damaged, affords an advantageous jumping-off place for operations against British troops holding the city. Japanese commanders move artillery and tanks in and begin to pummel the British. Positioned at the perimeter of the town, the British have dug in where they must, including residential neighborhoods. This frees the Japanese from any concern for civilians as they shall, since there are valid military targets in virtually every part of Singapore. The British, already host to hundreds of thousands of refugees, know that they are on the verge of logistical collapse. More than 1 million people congregate on the waterfront, seeking some escape from the brutal barrage. There is little food and less fresh water. On 11 February, General Sir Archibald Wavell, head of the Supreme Allied Command in the Far East, begins planning for a withdrawal. Though the British will not be able to take everyone off the island, they can, Wavell is told, evacuate the women and children, as well as selected officers and technicians. The evacuation takes place on the 11th. Lieutenant General A.E. Percival, left behind with what remains of Great Britain's Far Eastern force, is ordered to inflict maximum damage on the Japanese. Percival replies that he will do that, but that it is unlikely that he will be able to hold out for more than 2 days. He is fighting not just the Japanese, but the complete breakdown of Singapore's infrastructure. The lack of clean water threatens to spread disease throughout the city, and he is forced to take combat engineers off the lines and put them to work repairing water mains. That same day, Wavell sends a message to London. In his typically understated report, he says that the Japanese are getting on much more rapidly than they should, and that the fall of Singapore seems imminent and inevitable. On 14 February, all appears lost. Percival rallies his troops by reminding them that they are buying vital time for the Allied cause. A Japanese tank attack that morning is repulsed, but a second late in the afternoon pierces Percival's lines. The Japanese begin their methodical conquest of the city. The battle is finally lost when the Japanese capture Singapore's reservoirs, cutting off the water supply. On 15 February, the Japanese demand and receive the British forces' unconditional surrender. The victorious troops celebrate, singing the Japanese national anthem and raising toasts toward Tokyo. For the Rising Sun commanders, it has indeed been a glorious victory. The island of Singapore is in their hands a full month ahead of schedule, and the almost 140,000 casualties suffered by the British virtually bring to an end the era of English influence over East Asia. (20 January 1942, Berlin. In the suburb of Wannsee, Officials of the SS convene a meeting, the purpose of which is to coordinate the execution of a plan designed to, once and for all, resolve the so-called Jewish question. This program, the culmination of years of systematic oppression and the fulfillment of Adolf Hitler's prediction that a world war would result in the annihilation of the Jewish race throughout Europe, has come to be known as the final solution. When the Nazis came to power, they vowed to create a nation in which, to promote racial purity, Jews would be segregated from the rest of the population. The first solution thus became the expulsion of Jewish residents from hundreds of German towns and villages, forcing them into larger cities and leaving the smaller municipalities Judenrein, or Jew-free. The second solution approved by the Nazis was emigration. Encouraged by the increasingly oppressive policies of the Third Reich, between 1933 and 1939, more than half of the Jews living in Germany left the country, forced in doing so to surrender their homes, businesses, and property to the government. In 1939, with the coming of the war and the conquest of Poland, the number of Jews under German rule increased dramatically, and at the same time, emigration became nearly impossible. In response, the Nazis devised a third solution: segregation and confinement. Polish Jews were expelled from their homes and forced to live in restricted areas known as ghettos. Encircled by walls, the ghettos were by design overcrowded and unsanitary. The food rations were such that less than a year after it was established, 2,000 people a month were starving to death in the Warsaw Ghetto. As the Nazi drive continued eastward and the number of Jews under Nazi domination increased further, still a fourth solution was instituted. As the Wehrmacht rolled through eastern Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, and into western Russia, they were followed by Einsatzgruppen, special killing squads whose sole purpose was to murder the Jewish populations in conquered territories. In the summer and fall of 1941, as many as 1 million people in towns and cities all over Eastern Europe were rounded up and taken to nearby open fields, gravel pits, or ravines. There they were eliminated. The Einsatzgruppen were a model of efficiency. At Kiev, 33,000 men, women, and children were slaughtered in just 3 days. Still, it was not enough to satisfy Hitler and his cronies. In Berlin, plans for a fifth solution were begun, a program that would, through the annihilation of all the Jews in Europe, prove the ultimate answer to the Jewish question. Experiments were begun to discover the most expedient means of eradicating large numbers of human beings. Tests were conducted using Russian prisoners of war as well as Jews. Now, in December of 1942, the groundwork has been laid and work can begin in earnest. A number of camps will be constructed, but unlike the concentration camps that have been in operation since 1933, these will be designed and built specifically for the extermination of Jews. All elements of the program are to be cloaked in secrecy. None of the camps will be built in Germany itself. Most will be in Poland. Deportation will be referred to as resettlement. The location of the camps will be identified only as somewhere in the east. Gas chambers will be disguised as shower rooms so that the doomed will be unaware that they are about to die. As the conference concludes, the participants are pleased and are convinced Hitler will be as well. It is a glorious moment in the history of the Reich. With diligence, hard work, and solid engineering, they have devised a highly efficient, cost-effective means of killing millions of innocent people. February 1942, London. The RAF Bomber Command issues a directive drastically changing the strategy they will employ in their campaign against Germany. Rather than precision bombing of industrial, military, and transportation facilities, the British bombers will now focus their attention on the wholesale destruction of major cities, using what is termed area bombing. The RAF's change in policy stems from increased pressure by Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Since long-range bombers are currently the only way to strike back at the Germans, Churchill is determined that they be utilized for the greatest possible effect. Until now, British attempts to cripple the Nazi war machine by pinpoint bombing of crucial assets has been an abject failure. Forced to fly at night to elude German fighters, the bomber crews face the near impossible task of locating and bombing specific structures from 20,000 feet in darkness. Based on photo reconnaissance, a report released in mid-1941 revealed that only 1 in 3 bombers came within 5 miles of hitting their assigned targets. Results have been even worse in the Ruhr Valley, which is almost constantly enshrouded by a thick industrial haze. Here, in the very heart of the German war machine, only 1 in 10 bombers managed to come within the 5-mile radius. Churchill's advocacy of area bombing is based partly on Britain's own experience with the German Blitz. In a raid on the industrial city of Coventry in November of 1940, the Luftwaffe devastated over 100 acres of the city. The destruction caused to people's homes, to transportation, water, and electricity caused a greater interruption to wartime production than actual damage done to the factories themselves. With similar results in mind, RAF strategists are given a free hand in waging unrestricted war on Germany. Their primary objective is to destroy the morale of the German civil population, particularly the industrial workers. Also of concern to Churchill are the Russians. Stalin is becoming increasingly adamant that the Western Allies open a second front to relieve some of the pressure on the Red Army. While Churchill realizes an immediate invasion of the continent is not feasible, he hopes that by stepping up the bombing campaign, he can begin to erode the German power base, appeasing Stalin until a land offensive is possible. January 1942, Washington, D.C. Bowing to intense political pressure, President Franklin Roosevelt signs Executive Order 9066, which will allow military authorities to relocate residents of strategic areas. While the directive seems on the surface to be just another move by the government to shift the country into wartime operation, it is, in fact, a calculated political attack on a very specific group of people in a very specific location: Japanese Americans living near the West Coast. Since Pearl Harbor, a groundswell of sentiment encouraging the detention or expulsion of Japanese Americans from the region has risen within the local populace. The torch is picked up by local politicians and the flames fanned by the press. On 2 March, Lieutenant General John L. DeWitt declares California, Oregon, and Washington strategic areas. By the end of March, over 110,000 Japanese Americans are forced to abandon their homes, their businesses, and most of their belongings, and submit to internment by the War Relocation Authority. The intense distrust and prejudice are not merely a reaction to the war, rather, they are the fruits of a deeply rooted penchant for bigotry and discrimination against Japanese immigrants in this part of the country. For years, Japanese emigres settling in the West, as well as their American-born offspring, have been the subject of racist attitudes and laws, including restrictions on land ownership and immigration quotas. With the signing of the executive order, the stage was set for the military leadership of the Western Defense Command, at first reluctant to act, but now thoroughly caught up in the exclusionist movement, to take action. Now, these people, these Americans, who have struggled to build for themselves lives based on hope, opportunity, and success through hard work, at the hands of their own government, have been forced into lives filled with sorrow, uncertainty, and broken dreams. A quick mobilization can bring to the battlefield many assets: food, weapons, even foot soldiers. But other combat assets, primarily wisdom, vision, and leadership, cannot be so quickly acquired. Much of what will eventually be success or failure in this war rests on the shoulders of the generation of generals that are set to lead the way. At the core of that generation is a small group, some only recently elevated in rank, whose careers have followed eerily similar paths. Together they form what is shaping up to be the nucleus of the Army's War Command. Senior among them is Army Chief of Staff General George Marshall. The son of a Civil War veteran, Marshall attended the Virginia Military Institute and the Fort Leavenworth Army Staff College. He served in the Philippines and, after the outbreak of World War I, made a name for himself on Blackjack Pershing's staff as a brilliant tactician. When the war ended, Marshall returned to the United States and became a forceful voice for the modernization of America's Army, advocating a well-trained professional corps to be augmented in wartime by a kind of citizen army. An equally forceful advocate of modernization was General Douglas MacArthur, the youngest Army Chief of Staff in American history. A graduate of West Point, his first military assignment took him to the Philippines. At the outbreak of World War I, he advocated the formation of a division of citizen soldiers to augment the professional military. The resulting 42nd Division, comprised of National Guard units, served honorably and was to be Marshall's model for what became the Army Reserve. Twice wounded, twice gassed, by war's end, MacArthur was the most decorated American combat veteran in history. Pershing called him the best frontline general of the war. He returned to West Point as superintendent, broadening the curriculum to produce sophisticated, well-rounded officers. He toured Europe, met with the nascent Nazi leadership, and came to believe that a Second World War was inevitable. That war, MacArthur believed, would be dependent on the speed and mobility of tanks and aircraft. In 1930, he returned to the Philippines, where for 4 years his assistant was a young officer named Dwight Eisenhower. Eisenhower had been assigned by the Army to prepare a guidebook on battlefields in the Philippines. And under MacArthur's tutelage, he learned not just battle tactics, but also political strategy. MacArthur, at the time, was attempting to build the Philippine Armed Forces into a credible defense force, a task made more complicated by the world's pervasive pacifism. Eisenhower's counsel proved invaluable. As a trained tank officer, he believed strongly in the kind of warfare MacArthur saw as the future of battle. Much of Ike's belief in high-speed tactics had come, in turn, from his earlier contact with George Patton, a brash young officer he'd met at the Fort Meade Tank School. Patton, himself a West Point graduate, had volunteered for tank duty in World War I, finding the machines a perfect reflection of his own personality. In the meantime, Marshall joined the faculty at the Fort Benning Infantry School, where he met and befriended 2 outstanding young prospects, Joseph Stilwell and Omar Bradley. Marshall thought Stilwell one of the most brilliant and cultured young military minds he had ever encountered. A West Point graduate who had also spent several years in the Philippines, he served with distinction at the Battle of Verdun. After the war, his facility with languages prompted the Army to assign him to Beijing, where his main job was to familiarize himself with Chinese languages and customs. Bradley, a classmate of Eisenhower's at West Point, was an infantryman right down to his boots. Quiet, unassuming, he seemed content to study tactics while his more flamboyant classmates garnered the attention. Together, these old friends and long acquaintances form the backbone of the American military leadership. Now that America is involved in the war, each of these generals' roles in the coming conflagration seems almost preordained. Whether their years of preparation, the doctrines they helped develop, and the intimate knowledge of each other will make a difference in the war remains to be seen. But it is certain at this moment in history that they are as well prepared to lead an army of citizen soldiers as any nation could hope. 22 February 1942, Corregidor. At his fortified island headquarters, 3 miles off the coast of the Bataan Peninsula, General Douglas MacArthur receives word from Washington that President Roosevelt has ordered him to leave the Philippines immediately and proceed to Australia by way of Mindanao. Once in Australia, the general is to assume command of a new theater of operations encompassing the Southwest Pacific. MacArthur's first reaction is to refuse to comply with the president's order. Completely, almost fanatically devoted to the men of his command and the Filipino people, the thought of abandoning them in their darkest hour is abhorrent to MacArthur. Like a captain going down with his ship, he considers it his duty to remain on Corregidor, facing almost certain capture or death at the hands of the Japanese, and is willing to disobey his commander-in-chief rather than violate his personal honor and abdicate his responsibility. MacArthur's senior staff is of a more practical mind. Concurring with Roosevelt's reasoning, they tell the general that the fall of the Philippines is at this point inevitable, and that he can do more for his men and his people by fighting the Japanese from Australia than by remaining on Corregidor. Reluctantly, MacArthur notifies FDR that he will leave as requested, but asks for permission to delay for a brief period. An abrupt departure might convey panic to the troops, resulting in what he terms a sudden collapse. Roosevelt agrees. On 11 March, MacArthur senses the time has come, and along with his family and a few of his staff, he boards one of 4 battle-scarred PT boats that are to make the journey to Mindanao. It will by no means be a pleasure cruise. This small group will have to travel thousands of miles through enemy waters under skies completely dominated by the Japanese. As the boats depart, MacArthur hears a soldier on the dock remark that if he is lucky, his chances of surviving the journey are 1 in 5. As it turns out, the soldier's assessment is no exaggeration. The 2-day trek is so fraught with peril that upon arriving at Mindanao, MacArthur awards the crews of all 4 vessels the Silver Star. The trip from Mindanao to Australia is to be made in a group of B-17s, but the 4 planes dispatched to the island are in such poor shape, only one manages to arrive. An inspection reveals an aircraft so shockingly decrepit that it is sent back to Australia without passengers. MacArthur calls for the best 3 planes available in the U.S. or Hawaii to transport his party. On 16 March, 2 of the 3 B-17s arrive, but they seem to be little improvement over the last batch, held together as their pilots describe it with chewing gum and baling wire. There is, however, no time left to delay, and a tired, frustrated MacArthur climbs aboard. The planes, rattling and sputtering, rumble down the runway and climb into the sky. After changing course mid-flight to avoid being attacked by Japanese fighters, the group at long last sets down at Bachelor Field in Australia. Fearing the Japanese fighters might be in pursuit, MacArthur prepares to quickly board another plane for Melbourne. The members of the press, however, are hungry for a statement, and MacArthur, unhappy at being forced to abandon his post and determined to effect a rescue of his men, makes a somewhat terse but resolute declaration. The President of the United States, he says, ordered me to break through the Japanese lines and proceed from Corregidor to Australia for the purpose, as I understand it, of organizing the American offensive against Japan, a primary objective of which is the relief of the Philippines. I came through, and I shall return. When Adolf Hitler and the German High Command began planning the conquest of Russia, their calculations were based on the overwhelming superiority of the Wehrmacht over the Red Army, in sheer numbers as well as in equipment and tactics. But now, with the Nazis being driven back all along the front, it is becoming clear that Hitler and his cronies failed to consider a significant factor which has felled Russia's enemies time and again through history: the unflagging and unshakable will of the Russian people. With shocking regularity, the dark specter of war has reared its ugly head in this country, the result of both outside aggression and internal strife. Life in wartime is something akin to tradition here, so much so that when the announcement of the German invasion came, the response of the people was more a reflex than a reaction. Calmly, the people set about emptying their bank accounts and converting their money into food, furniture, hardware, anything of value, knowing from experience that during wartime commodities are much more valuable than paper currency, and that some things cannot be purchased at any price. Now, as the Russian effort continues to increase, young men all over the country leave their homes and families to join the Red Army. Their training is minimal, and their transfer to the front swift. The enemy they face may be highly disciplined and experienced in battle, but these boys enter the fray infused with a fanatical love of country and an indifference to death that betrays their youth. A Russian soldier, having known little in the way of comfort in his life, will endure long periods of hostile weather, bad food, and little sleep, and then throw himself into a suicidal charge against a superior enemy with a ferocity the likes of which the Germans have never experienced. Soviet women are no less committed to the fight. Unlike America, here women in uniform are not an oddity. They work in medical as well as other essential support positions, and they are armed, ready to defend themselves and their country should their positions be overrun. Those of both genders unable to serve in the military join the fight in other ways. Besides working in factories, they dig ditches, build revetments, knit socks and other articles of clothing, pack boxes with soap and candy, anything that will help support the war effort. In the rural areas, farmers remain busy producing food for the nation and the military. Where young men have left to join the army, other family members take up the slack. But here, too, the people are prepared to defend their country. Civilian militias are trained and ready to take up arms against the invaders. No inch of Russian soil will be taken without paying the price. It had been the intent of the Nazis to conquer Russia in 6 weeks. The High Command reasoning that an inferior race of people could never withstand the crushing force of a horde of well-trained Aryan soldiers. But the generals at the front, with each day bringing a new defeat and their troops increasingly demoralized, are beginning to realize what would-be conquerors have discovered time and again throughout history: that every Russian is a Russian soldier. For March 1942, China, charged with the dual tasks of heightening U.S. aid to the Chinese war effort and increasing the combat skills of the Chinese troops, General Joseph Stilwell establishes his headquarters at Chungking in the recently formed China-Burma-India Theater. Having been a foreign language professor at West Point and later a military observer in China, the 58-year-old Stilwell is well suited to the daunting task before him. He has a keen appreciation and love for the cultures of the Far East, a trait that will serve him well, for his mission is as much diplomatic as military. Complicating this mission is Japan's initial and successful thrust into Burma. The Japanese are intent on effecting the total military and economic isolation of China, and by sweeping into and across Burma, they hope to sever the last land route to the Chinese subcontinent. By 22 February, the poorly trained and ill-equipped Burmese and Indian troops are routed, mere courage being insufficient to shield their land from Japanese onslaught. Stilwell arrives only in time to aid in the retreat of soldiers and evacuation of refugees. At their first meeting, Chinese General Chiang Kai-shek appoints Stilwell Chief of Staff of the Chinese Army. While this may seem remarkable, the position is largely ceremonial. Chiang's army is primarily a malnourished, untrained aggregate of farmers and laborers, conditions which Stilwell intends to rectify. Even if he is successful in doing so, however, the degree of actual participation by the Chinese forces in America's war with Japan is somewhat dubious, as Chiang seems more interested in fighting the Chinese communists to his north than in repelling the Japanese invaders. As the outside world becomes more aware of the struggle in China, Stilwell garners much of the media's attention. The image of Stilwell presented to the public, while not entirely inaccurate, is one-dimensional. To the world, he is Vinegar Joe, a tough-as-nails, pragmatic, hardened caricature of the American fighting man. His gaunt, sinewy frame, angular features, and weathered skin lend themselves to such characterizations. Standing in marked contrast to this image is the warmth and caring he displays toward those under his command. To his troops, he is Uncle Joe, the general who walks the lines with them, treating even the lowest private as an equal. How strange and disappointing it must be for these men to read the exploits of Vinegar Joe, to see in print a mere fraction of the man they have come to know and consider a friend. But in times such as these, when the country and the world are hungry for heroes, it is sometimes necessary that they be created for the public, even at the expense of the very humanity for which they are fighting. "27 February 1942, Java. After taking Singapore on 15 February, the Japanese have now focused their attention on taking this remaining outpost in the Dutch East Indies. The survival of the garrison here is heavily dependent on protection by the combined Allied fleet under the command of Dutch Rear Admiral Karl Doorman. Steaming off the northern coast of Java, Doorman spots a large Japanese convoy and prepares to engage it. Almost immediately, Doorman realizes he is at a huge disadvantage. Firing from a distance of 5.5 miles, the Japanese are using spotter planes to direct their fire and quickly zero in on the Allied column. The British cruiser Exeter is severely damaged by an 8-inch round and is forced to drop out of the formation. As the Exeter turns away, what had been seen as an inconvenience turns into a disastrous flaw. The combined fleet, made up of American, British, Australian, and Dutch ships, have never exercised together and, most importantly, have no common signal code or battle doctrine. Several of the ships see the Exeter turning to port and follow her, believing Doorman has ordered the change in course. With the Allied fleet in an extremely vulnerable position, the Japanese launch dozens of their long lance torpedoes at the floundering vessels. Incredibly, only one Dutch destroyer is sunk. Doorman finally manages to regain control of his ships and withdraws. Low on fuel and torpedoes, the Allied fleet makes for the port of Batavia. Unknowingly, they steam right into a Dutch minefield and a British destroyer is sunk. Moving north, out of the minefield, Doorman again encounters the Japanese fleet. This time, the Japanese torpedoes are far more effective. One by one, the Allied ships are hit and sunk. As his flagship, the cruiser De Ruyter, is hit, Doorman orders the 2 remaining ships under his command to withdraw and make for Australia. He then slips beneath the waves with his ship. This sacrifice of the Allied fleet has done little to impede the Japanese plan for the conquest of Java. On 1st April, they invade the island and by the 9th have it securely in their hands. The fall of Java and the destruction of the Allied fleet are sources of grave concern to Allied commanders. Australia is now the lone Allied outpost in the region and becomes more and more vulnerable with each passing day. If the Japanese decide to come ashore here, stopping them will be difficult indeed. The Japanese military, that has already proven its prowess on land, has now proven it is the dominant naval force in the region as well. So, you want to save the world, eh? You want to be a hero, Mr. Jones? Well, before we all march off to do battle with pure evil, you're probably wondering what military life is going to be like. The American military is known for its hospitality. Cheerful and knowledgeable guides greet each recruit personally. Don't think them unfriendly if they choose not to make small talk. They know, as you will soon enough, that there's a lot to do and not much time. You're already late for your complimentary physical examination. If you're like most regular guys, when you think of fighting fascism, you think of being medically probed in front of 300 perfect strangers. Now's your chance. Don't forget to cough. Much as we'd like to linger, the tailor is ready for your fitting. 40 regular? This ought to do fine, Mr. Jones. It's a 56 long. Not everyone can pull that off, but on you, we don't think fabulous would be too strong a word. It's just, it needs a little something. Ah, a new hairstyle. No time for fussing on the battlefield, of course. Something sharp but practical will have to do. Something like, yes, perfect. Very now. Hungry? The Army knew you were going to say that. Pull up a chair. High in calories and fat, low in flavor. Real men don't eat fiber, right, recruit? Right. And in case you don't have teeth, there's no need to chew this enticing gruel. Just shovel it in and swallow. A tip from the veterans, though. Don't get carried away and eat the shingle along with the... What's that you say, Mr. Jones? You don't understand how one army can be this courteous, this sensitive? Well, it's no accident, that's for sure. There's a whole breed of officer, morale officers they're called, whose entire existence is consumed with ascertaining and providing anything any GI might need to keep him happy. Well, almost anything. No, not that either. Ah, that's more like it. Just what the GI ordered. A little something to take your mind off important duties like saving the world from evil. Mr. Jones, America may or may not be the world's policeman, but Americans are certainly the kitchen's policeman. Your first combat assignment might not be what you expect. The War of the Potatoes? The Battle of the Pots and Pans? Is this any way to fight a war? We'll leave that question to the historians. For now, you'll want to get to bed. Well, maybe bed is a bit generous. You'll want to get to slant, because tomorrow's sure to be off to a fast start. You've got a lot to learn about how an army works. You're going to have to learn to march, to salute, and how to walk like a monkey. You're going to have to shed those extra civilian pounds and get yourself into top physical condition. And you're going to do it by learning how to push a ball with your nose. So sleep tight, Mr. Jones. It may be hard to believe at the end of your very first day of military life, but you really are a hero. Even if your red badge of courage is nothing more than dishpan hands.